Good evening, all. Just to let you know, this is not Rebecca McGinnis, this is Scott McGinnis here.
Oh my God. Hi, Scott. So good
Hi,
to see
Scott.
you. Like, we can't see you.
Where are you? Oh, Rebecca. There you go. Rebecca's screen.
Yeah, well, you can see me. Here I am.
Yes, there he is. There he is. So
Good
good.
to see you, all the old timers. Sorry, young timers. Well, Dick's the old timer. I know that.
Nice to see you too.
Donna, so nice to see you. It's been a while.
Been a long time.
Yeah. Michelle.
And look, we have Ana Lucia from Beijing, China. Wow.
Oh,
And Elizabeth, good to see you. Okay, well, it's going to be 5 after soon. Maybe we should get started. What do you think?
Got to give time for Dick to talk.
Yeah, it's sort of.
Yeah, you got your mic muted, so you're not going to say anything, Richard,
Thank
right?
María, está tronando súper duro aquí.
I know. We're in the middle of a
Wow.
major thunderstorm in LA.
Oh my.
Rare, very rare thing, but here it is. Hopefully you can't hear it. We'll see. Okay, so I think I'm going to get started with the opening remarks so that we can then get to the questions by 5:15, and that'll give us 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Okay, so good evening, everybody. I'm Maria Carreira, and on behalf of my colleagues, Sybil Alexandrov and Alejandro Lee, I welcome you to HLX. We created this initiative to respond to what we see as a pressing need in the field for practical, place-based strategies for enacting the general principles of HL teaching in different instructional settings, languages, educational levels, etc. At the core of our mission is the view that teachers are a key source of knowledge, ideas, and guidance for continuous improvement of HL education. This bottom-up view of education, of course, is not new, but it took the pandemic and our friend Zoom to reveal to us the unprecedented opportunities that are now available for dialogue, collaboration, and connection across distances. Tonight's event is one such opportunity. And we're launching this initiative by looking back at the origins of the field, because to quote JFK, we celebrate the past to awaken the future. And so we hope that this event will not only be retrospective in nature, but also prospective, that is, about what lies ahead or should lie ahead for our field. Our panelists, I don't need to tell you, are some of the most influential architects and change makers of our field. And we have another change maker of our field here, Scott McGinnis. I'm going to invite him to contribute. We're delighted to have you here, Scott. And it's not surprising that so many of you are here to listen to them tonight. Alejandro, Sybil, and I, for our part, are most grateful to them for generously accepting our invitation to be here and for enthusiastically supporting this initiative. But before we begin and hear from them, I want to put in a plug for the talented teachers who are at the front lines doing the work of heritage language teaching and who are also change makers and architects of our field. HL teachers can make such a difference in the lives of language minority students. I know this firsthand because I had such a person in childhood, and I am so happy that she can be here with us today. In the mid-1970s, long before the term HL learner existed, Sister Judith Murphy of St. Scholastica High School in Chicago understood that I was different from the mainstream second language students of the time and laid out a specialized course of study for me. And I can still recall that very first day of high school when she pulled me aside and told me that I would not be spending my freshman year conjugating verbs in Spanish 1 or even Spanish 2. Instead, she would work with me one-on-one to develop my reading and writing skills so that I could take advanced culture and literature courses during the rest of my time at St. Scholastica. And so you see, long before the pedagogy of HL languages existed, Sister Judith Murphy already knew what to do. She saw me for who I was, embraced my strengths, and tended to my needs with cariño, affection, and respeto, respect. Ever the pioneer, Sister Judith was also an architect of an early Spanish dual language curriculum in Chicago that is now in its 20th year of operation. Hopefully we'll get the chance to hear a little bit about this amazing program during this discussion, or if not today, at the HL Programs Fair, which we'll have in September, and I'll talk about it in a few seconds. For now, please join me in recognizing Sister Judith and all past and present transformational language teachers with a big round of applause. Okay, and before turning things over to Alejandro, oh, I'm sorry, did we get Sister, can everybody see Sister Judith Murphy? Yes, there you are. Okay, wonderful. Before handing things over to Alejandro, who will introduce our distinguished panelists, I want to give you a heads up on two upcoming events at HLX. On December 2nd, we will have a community read and discussion on post-method language teaching and what it means for HL teaching with Professor Ana Menendez of Hong Kong University and Professor Jason Parba of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And then on February 5th and 6th of next year, we'll be hosting the HL Programs Fair, where we invite teachers and program directors to showcase what they're doing to serve the needs of their heritage language learners. And of course, we are honored to have Dr. Michelle Aoki as our keynote speaker there. Michelle is with us tonight. Hopefully, we'll get to hear a little bit more from Sybil about these events and others at the end of tonight's program. But if we run out of time, you can always get more information at our website, hlxchange.com. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you, Maria. It's a true pleasure to introduce our panelists. I will start with Dr. Richard Brecht, an emeritus professor at the University of Maryland. He currently serves as the co-director of the American Council's Research Center, a think tank devoted to providing evidence for language policy and management decisions in education and the workplace. He's the founding executive director of the Center for Advanced Study of Language and co-founder and chief language officer of Genie. He has helped found and lead several academic organizations, including American Councils for International Education, the Center for Advanced Study of Language, the National Council of Less Commonly Taught Languages, and the National Foreign Language Center. His latest initiative is the Star Talk DLI Partnerships, funded by the National Foreign Language Center. He has authored numerous scholarly publications on language policy and second language acquisition and Slavic and Russian linguistics. Among the latest is a briefing paper, America's Languages, Challenges and Promise, for the recent Commission on Language Learning of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Our second guest is Dr. Donna Christian, Senior Fellow at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Dr. Christian's research focuses on the role of language in education, including issues of second language learning and dialect diversity. She has been involved in research, professional development, and technical assistance related to two-way bilingual immersion, including a study for the National Center for Research on Education, Diversity, and Excellence. She's currently a senior advisor to CAL's Heritage Language Initiative, Biliteracy Research Program, and English for Heritage Language Speakers Program. She serves on so many boards. I can only mention a few: boards of directors of the International Research Foundation for English Language Education, the editorial board of the Heritage Language Journal, and of the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. General Advisory Committee of the National Accessible Reading Assessment Projects, Advisory Board of the Hispanic Family Literacy Institute. She has served several terms as an officer and member of the Board of Directors of the Joint National Committee for Languages. Our next guest is Dr. Joy Kreeft Peyton, a Senior Fellow at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Dr. Kreeft Peyton has been working on issues of heritage language and mother tongue education for over 30 years. She was a founding member of the Alliance for the Advancement of Heritage Languages and is now president of the Coalition for Community-Based Heritage Language Schools. She's passionate about collaborating with others to ensure that these schools are excellent, visible, respected, and an active part of the national language learning landscape. She's co-editor of Heritage Languages in America, Preserving a National Resource, and of Handbook of Heritage, Community, and Native American Languages in the United States, Research, Educational Practice, and Policy. She has worked in Ethiopia, Nepal, and the Gambia on projects funded by USAID and the World Bank to develop educational materials. Our fourth guest is Dr. Ana Roca, Professor Emerita of Spanish and Linguistics in the Department of Mother Languages at Florida International University. Dr. Roca holds a Doctor of Arts degree in Spanish with concentrations in Spanish and Spanish American literatures and cognitive fields in applied linguistics and social linguistics from the University of Miami. She completed postdoctoral intensive work at the Linguistic Society of America, 1989 Summer Institute of Linguistics. Her research interests include Spanish in the United States, problems in language learning, language planning, Spanish-English bilingualism, social linguistics, and Spanish applied linguistics, particularly social linguistics and pedagogical issues related to US Spanish language and culture, the teaching of Spanish as a heritage language, and foreign language education policy issues. And our last but not least guest is Dr. Guadalupe Valdés, the Bonnie Katz Tenenbaum Professor of Education in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. She just told us that she retired, so congratulations, Dr. Valdés. But she will continue working, of course, on different projects. She's a founding partner of Understanding Language, an initiative that focuses attention on the role of language in subject area learning. Valdés's research explores issues of bilingualism relevant to teachers in training and the role of education in national policies on immigration. Much of her work has focused on the English-Spanish bilingualism of Latinos in the United States and on discovering and describing how two languages are developed, used, and maintained by individuals who become bilingual in immigrant communities. Her research in the educational setting has focused on Latinos from elementary school to college. Please join me in welcoming them to our first event.
Thank you, Alejandro. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start out by reminding you to mute your audio. And also, I want to let you know that if everything goes as planned, and so far we're on schedule, we should have about 15 minutes at the end to take questions from the audience. But in the meantime, you can also put your questions into the chat. The three of us will be manning the chat during the course of this conversation. And I'd like to start our retrospective by talking about the work, of course, of Guadalupe Valdés, alone and with Richard Teschner in the 70s, mid 70s, and then in the 80s, in what was then called the teaching of Spanish to native speakers, or SNS. And this is where I think many of the principles of HL teaching, the ones that we recognize today as principles of HL teaching, were born, many of these ideas. And so, Guadalupe, I want to ask you about what context you found yourself in the 1970s that energized you to pursue this seminal work.
Well, thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here and to go back and recall. I think the questions that you asked were really, it took me back a long time. So to understand what happened in the 70s, it's important to recall the changes that were part of the educational context at the time. We were in open admissions or open enrollment. And what that meant is that it was a type, open enrollment and open admission were a type of unselective and non-competitive college admission process in the United States, in which the only criterion was a high school diploma or a GED. So open admissions or open enrollment was heavily promoted in the 60s and 70s as a ways of reducing discrimination in college admissions and to promote the education of the underprivileged. Certainly that sounds familiar today, doesn't it, right? We find that at different points, people become concerned about who's in college and why are they there and how do we let them in. But as a result, in the 70s, you had public colleges and universities increased enrollment of students who ordinarily would not have been thought of as college material. And if you happen to be in a college or university at that time, which I was, what did not change were the requirements. And of course, what colleges had at the time and continue to have is that foreign language requirement, not world languages. We didn't talk about world languages. We talk about them as foreign languages. And there was typically a 2-year requirement. And so when students entered, and in the Southwest, it was Mexican origin students, and in the Northeast, it was the Puerto Rican origin students. And we didn't do the Latinx at that time. We simply talked about the particular origin of the students because there were histories there, histories that were complicated, but also led to where students were at that time. So if they chose to take Spanish as the language that they wanted to meet the foreign language requirement with, they found themselves in incredible difficulties. And they did because the faculty that were teaching had no experience with students that were not acquiring the language as a new language, with students who had grown up with a language at home, but did not read and write the language because they had been educated totally in English, right? So it was a confusing time, not even who were these students, but what to call them. So for a long time, it was a real debate about whether they called them native speakers, pseudo-native speakers, quasi-native speakers. None of the terms really fit, right? So at one point, I went to Canada and pulled Jim Cummings and his work and called them heritage speakers, right? And so, but that was Canada was the first group that called heritage language learners. And it wasn't a really good term either, right? But of course, what you had with the people that were teaching at the time is that most of them had learned the languages that they taught as foreign languages, or they were the particular privileged speakers of, in the case of Spanish, of peninsular Spanish, or of the varieties of Spanish that were class-based, right? The class-based, higher class-based varieties of Spanish. So they did not like rural varieties of Spanish, right? So it didn't matter how one wanted to defend them and say, Aiga has been there for the longest time, Caiga and has stayed there, but Aiga dropped out. But if you looked at it historically, we find no differences in terms of the grammar itself. So we had a lot of problems in trying to decide how could we support notions of what these students were to accomplish when many of them did not graduate because they did not pass the foreign language requirement. But the entire profession didn't really think about this in the ways in which we now think about it. So there were still ideologies of language, and now we recognize them so clearly. Now we're talking about racial linguistics, and we're actually talking about race head on. But in the 70s, nobody talked about race. It was considered to be impolite. So we only hinted at it. We hinted at rural versus urban, but we really didn't say, you don't like these kids because these are working class kids and they're not like you, right? No son los elegantes kind of thing. So it was a difficult moment to be working at. But I think that what we tried to do is to say, can we work a little bit at a time, Dick and I? Can we actually produce curriculum? Can we get the textbooks out there? Can we get the message out to the profession that we need to move away from the view of let's undo the damage that has been done at home? And that, by the way, came from someone who had worked on Canadian French, because the same thing had happened to Canadian French. The idea that what one had to do as a teacher of modern languages was to undo the damage that had been done at home. Porque hablan tan feo. They really did not speak the way they were expected to speak. They were not really good. And clearly the curriculum was based on a contrastive analysis in the case of English and Spanish, of what those learners of a foreign language needed to do. So everything was just the wrong-headed. To learn the rules of ser en estar when somebody has an internal grammar, right, made no sense whatsoever. But they were tortured, okay, in trying to actually have to think about ser en estar in ways that they really had never had to. Because they produced the language particularly well. So we had lots to do, and we know that it took a long time for people to listen. And now I go back and I think about the fact that foreign language departments continue to still do some of the things they used to do. I'm not sure that we're totally in the right place, but I think we're in a better place. At least people can talk about ideologies of language. At least people can talk about, and I currently now believe that the whole problem is the curricularization of language. So I've been writing a lot about how curricularizing language is a really profound problem. But I didn't know that when it was the 70s, right? So my analysis over time has certainly changed dramatically as well.
Thank you, Guadalupe. And still within Spanish, I want to turn to Anna now. And we know, Anna, that the Spanish in the US conference, which I consider a precursor to the HL conferences of today, was started in 1980. You organized several of these conferences and edited important volumes in connection with this conference, which were very influential in the development of Spanish for native speakers. Can you tell us a little bit about this conference and how it contributed to the development of the field of HL languages, as well as other things that were other developments of the time in the 80s?
Well, let's see. I think the first one was organized maybe by Lucia Elias Olivares quite a while back. I think she was at the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle. But I went to my very first one, I believe in 1986, when I had just completed my Doctor of Arts. And there is where I first heard Guadalupe, because she was a keynote speaker. And I have to tell you, Guadalupe, I was so impressed because I had been reading all your articles, and your articles are the ones that got me interested in Spanish in the United States and in the teaching of Spanish to native speakers, which is what we called it back then. I was in a literature track at the University of Miami and have my master's. And later on, I was given a fellowship. And within that fellowship, which was the Doctor of Arts, I wasn't going to say no to what was going to pay for me my schooling. I was able to choose a different track. And I was able to then work in educational linguistics, social linguistics, pedagogy, which is what I wanted to do. So I became interested in that. And that was the year that I went to my first conference at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And for me, it was wonderful. I just finally realized I had all of these people who were interested in the same thing. I heard Guadalupe Valdés for the first time, and it was just so enriching. I think at some point I went to the one in Iowa, and freezing Iowa, they asked, where would you like to have the next one? And I had attended prepared with backing from my university and the Latin American studies. So that was the first one I organized, I believe was in 1988 at FIU. The next one I think was in the 90s, maybe 1999. And then the last one I did, it must have been every 10 years, in 2009. And it was just really a wonderful experience to bring people together, not just in the area of Spanish in the US, but also it was Spanish in contact with other languages to within the same conference or an additional conference together. And that also put Spanish in the US in a different circle, so to speak, so that it would also bring other scholars who were interested in Spanish in contact with other languages, not just English in the US. I just think that obviously this is the largest speaking minority group in the United States of another language, which we know. So a lot of the work that has been done in pedagogy has been applied also to the other minority languages, the heritage languages as we call them now. But we really, and particularly Guadalupe, who's a pioneer in this, laid the groundwork for so many of us who were interested in this topic, who were teaching the courses. I always taught Spanish as a heritage language, Spanish for native speakers, whatever for bilingual speakers, so many different names. When I don't know, you wanted me to talk a little bit about my own experience as a student. And we heard your experience in the 80s, you said, or 70s? Well, I'm older than you, so my experience goes back to the 60s. So when I arrived in Miami in 1962 as a 9.5-year-old, and I started elementary school here, and some of you may have heard this story, but it's one to remember really, because it also talks about the things we talk about today, which is racism and discrimination and things like that, that as a kid, you don't really, know these terminologies and things. I did not speak English. What I spoke was Spanish. I just arrived and I started 4th grade, and there was no Spanish for native speakers at that point in my elementary school here. And I was put in a Spanish class where we would go to the cafeteria and watch talking heads on the TV. And then we would go to the classroom and have an American teacher who did not speak Spanish, but she would make us repeat the things that we had learned in the cafeteria on the TV. I did not understand her instructions in English because I did not speak English yet. You know what my grade was in my report card? for my Spanish class, F. I got an F. I mean, I just could not understand that because I didn't do what she wanted me to do in front of the class. I didn't understand her instructions and it didn't make any sense to me. I already spoke Spanish. So that was one experience. But fortunately, later on in junior high, middle school, I had a wonderful Spanish teacher like your teacher that you had. And I had my first Spanish for native speakers class in junior high, which was wonderful. It was also a place where I felt, you know, the warmth of the teacher in a foreign culture at that point for me. Miami is not the Miami that we know now where everybody speaks Spanish or most people speak Spanish. It's a bilingual, multilingual city. It was a very American city in a way. And so later on in high school, I was fortunate enough to have a totally wonderful program for native speakers that went all the way to Spanish S5, where, you know, it was specialized and so on. So, I mean, I was already reviewing grammar and writing and composition and reading, you know, Spanish civilization and culture, Hispanic American culture, reading Lorca, reading this, reading that. I mean, we were actually reading. So for me, what it did was it allowed me to expand my reading abilities and writing abilities and to speak Spanish in the classroom with a native speaker teacher who was also excellent. So that helped me a lot to maintain my language in what is a foreign country, although Miami now feels like a foreign country for the Americans. But I mean, at that point, it was the other way around. And a very racialized city, it still is in many ways, a city that has always had a very conservative aspect to it, where, you know, as a kid, when we looked for housing, and I knocked on the door, and I have told you this story, and I didn't really speak English very well, but I said, "Do you permit pets?" with my little accent. And the woman said, "Pets, yes, but Cubans, no." And she slammed the door on my nose. So, I mean, that was my experience as a kid here. I feel that the Spanish in the U.S. conference was very important in the publications that came out, the people that it brought into the field, the graduate students that we mentored and who were interested also in the field, because not that many people have been writing about this. There were, you know, you can count them in two hands, but now it's flourished so much. People are writing dissertations. I have participated in dissertations that have to do with this topic. There's so many things going on right now. It's expanded astronomically. I think we also need to mention someone like, well, Cecilia, who's here, who's also been very active in this field and publishing edited works in all kinds of articles. And also John Lipsky, even though he's so multifaceted, I don't know when he sleeps because he publishes so much, but he's also done a very interesting, good overview of the field, which is worth reading to have that summary nicely put together. I mean, I don't know what else you'd like me to comment on. I've seen the field grow so much and incorporate ideas that come from different disciplines, which is very important. We can't never, one thing I learned, and we all know, we can't just look at language from strictly a linguistic point of view, because language is influenced by so many factors, and of course it's going to cut across different disciplines. So we do need to look at, like particularly right now, what has happened in the United States. You know, what are the attitudes that people have toward language and toward the people who speak these languages? How has that affected the funding in the schools? Why are we not funding languages, period, better than we are doing? Why are we still stuck? Even though we know the importance and we've had so many reports that have been published, where is the funding? Where is it going? Coral Way Elementary, way back in the 60s, was a very good program. That also needs to be looked at again. And how can we make it better? How can we make these programs better for all the students from the elementary level to later on through college? We have good work. It needs to be implemented. And I think we've done a lot of professional development, because before we didn't have very much of this. Now we do, but we need to figure out a way to implement it better in more places. At least now we talk about it. We hire people who are specializing in heritage languages. We have coordinators. We never had any of this before. when we started. When I started at FIU, there was no classes for heritage speakers, none. Everything was, and this is Miami. Does that make any sense? No, not at all. So I started making new courses immediately for the curriculum. I said, that's ridiculous. You have to, I mean, how can we teach all these Cubanitos, you know, and all these people who speak Spanish here in Miami? How can you put them in a Spanish as a foreign language class? So things have changed a lot, but they still need to change for a better place for these classes.
Thank you, and we'll be talking about the changes that
Yeah.
need to come about.
Yeah.
Now I want to turn to Joy, because even before there was Spanish for native speakers, long before that, there were supplementary or community schools run by parents. In fact, we know from Heinz Claw's seminal work, The American Bilingual Tradition, that in 1876, there were some 350,000 children studying German in supplementary schools in the US. Amazing. So community schools have been very much a part of this country's linguistic landscape since its inception, basically. Now, focusing on the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when Joshua Fishman did his seminal work on community schools, can you tell us why that was so important, what he learned, why it was so important to the current discussion, that what we're talking about as a retrospective, and why it's so important as we start to think about the future?
Yeah, thank you for the great opportunity to talk about Joshua Fishman, because he really, you know, in the midst of all the beautiful work that you all were doing, but he started his work in the 1960s. He started focusing on community-based schools. In the 1960s, he identified 1,855 community-based heritage language schools. And in the 1980s, 6,533 of those schools. And at one point, probably in the 1980s, he said, if we think about European languages, indigenous languages, languages spoken around the world that are now spoken in this country, which Dick Brecht wants to call America's languages, and we'll hear about that soon. If we just think about where those languages are taught, we will find thousands of schools teaching hundreds of languages. And of course, many of those languages were not and still are not taught in schools. And many of those languages and the proficiency of those students who speak those languages are still not recognized in many schools. And that's something we can talk about, we're working on moving forward with. But so Joshua Fishman just shifted he didn't shift the conversation, he just brought this whole community into the language conversation. We now, the Coalition of Community-Based Heritage Language Schools, are trying to document all of the community-based schools in the country. We're making progress, but we are nowhere near documenting the schools the way he did. As soon as we started working together on heritage language issues, Joshua's work was central to ours. Joshua's work inspired our work. And we held our first National Heritage Language Conference at Cal State Long Beach in 1999. And that was Donna Christian and me working with Dick Brecht and Maria and Scott McGinnis to put that conference together. Maria was the person on site. Joshua and Guadalupe, who we've already heard from, were the keynote speakers at that conference. Can you imagine? I mean, people who came to that conference were just like wiped out, like, whoa, oh my gosh, what are we doing here? It inspired, just really inspired the whole movement. And then after the conference, we did a book which was mentioned earlier, Heritage Languages in America, Preserving a National Resource, which Scott and I co-edited. And, but just to do the conference, to do the book, it was really Joshua and Guadalupe that launched us forward, that the group of us who did that conference. And Anna, I think you were a speaker at that conference too. I'm pretty
was.
sure, and have a chapter in the
Yeah.
book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're very grateful to Joshua. And throughout his life, he and his wife, what's his wife's name? I forget. Oh, that's terrible. He had, and his wife stayed in touch with us throughout his entire life. So that was fabulous. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Joy. And I should say, Joy is continuing the work of Joshua Fishman with the very important work she's doing with community language schools. Wonderful work.
I want
Thank
to
you.
mention, he was
Thank
a keynote speaker in the first conference that I did, Joshua Fishman.
Oh.
And he was always just wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
really wonderful.
He's not only a great researcher and a great speaker, he's a fabulous collaborator. He really did have a spirit of collaboration.
Very
Thank you
nice-
for saying that, Anna.
Very nice person too. At least for me, I
Yeah.
had very nice interactions with him. Even
Okay.
when I disagreed with him at a conference at the symposium on his birthday. I remember I was sitting in front of him and I was disagreeing with something that he had published. And I had him right in front of me and he took it very well.
Okay, so now that we've looked at what Dick called it, the prehistory of the field of HL teaching and education, I'm going to turn to Dick and Donna and ask them where in time they place the emergence of what we know today as a field of heritage languages, as a discipline, for example, encompassing many languages, not just Spanish, with an institutional presence in public schools and its own terminology, a research agenda, etc. So what was the social context in which this comes about? And what specific initiatives were you involved in?
Okay, Dick said that I need to go first, so I'll begin. And it was so lovely. First of all, congratulations to you, Maria and Sybil and Alejandro, for the HL exchange. I think just that it's a wonderful continuation of all the work that we're talking about, and it's really what's needed at this time. And I just want to congratulate you and thank you for also for bringing us together and prompting us to think about where we came from. And a few of us here actually lived through those decades. And so we're kind of remembering our own personal history as well as thinking about the history of the field. And I think that a lot of the heritage language work was coming from research, policy, and practice. We've heard a lot about the practice aspect, the teaching Spanish to native speakers and all, but people in research were thinking about language attrition from a linguistic point of view. And those who are losing their languages are often heritage language speakers. There were, of course, the sociolinguistic studies of Joshua Fishman and a lot of other people who were working at the time. And then some beginnings of policy when we think about, because we're thinking about heritage languages both as indigenous from people with indigenous backgrounds and immigrant backgrounds. And so there were beginning to be thoughts about policies related to Native American languages. So I think we had a context that was developing that let us bring this out and give it a name. It had many names and we just picked one. But I think even in the late 80s, when the Center for Applied Linguistics worked with UCLA on the Center for Language Acquisition and Research, that was the first time, at least that I was aware, that people were talking about the intersection of bilingual education and foreign language education. And we really started talking about dual language at that time called two-way interlocking programs as a marriage of those. And at the heart of that were the speakers in foreign language who were native speakers of the language of instruction, or in bilingual programs. We were also looking at the needs and the strengths of the kids who were not English speakers, who were learning English and progressing in their native language, and giving English speakers a chance to do both. And I really came into this from the dual language education perspective, and Cal had been working in a lot of these areas, Cal being Center for Applied Linguistics. But I think there were these rich research traditions that were coming up, looking at, teaching strategies, looking at, as I said, language attrition, looking at the context for language learning, and then looking at the practice, the actual practice in schools when students come to school, bringing with them their community language, and hopefully getting the opportunity to develop that community language. And then I think about the wonderful work of Lily Wong Fillmore, who opened our eyes to the problem of interrupting that development and the cultural issues in the community where kids wouldn't be able to talk to their grandparents if they lost their community language, and really began to learn about the social emotional toll that loss could have. So in that context, I think we had an opportunity, and I will say that as far as the Center for Applied Linguistics goes, and I think NFLC, the National Foreign Language Center as well, Russ Campbell was the catalyst. And we've mentioned a few names of people so far. I think one person that we have to mention is Olga Kagan, who was very influential in those times and continued to be, and you can talk about what happened with her work later. But Russ Campbell came to us and was working with Dick Brecht and others at the National Foreign Language Center and said, we need to do something about language learning in the United States and preserving the languages that we have in the United States. We need to do something. What can we do? And he brought us together on that topic. I mean, we were working together, but he brought us together on that topic. And that really began what was the catapult that brought NFLC and Cal together and started with the first Heritage Language Conference. And I remember, they weren't smoke-filled rooms, but I remember the rooms when we were sitting around trying to decide what to call it. And I was very interested that Guadalupe mentioned the Canadian term, because we ultimately settled on the Canadian term, thinking that that had the broadest reach, the broadest comprehensibility. And from our two sides, I will also say that Joy Peyton and Scott McGinnis made this happen. They carried it forward, they organized everything, they made things, and then of course they did the books that came out of the conferences. So I really think we had that, and then there's so many things, but bouncing off of that was the English only movement. In the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of emphasis on English only and the importance of everybody learning English, and laws being passed, and countering that was the English Plus movement, and this fit into that political context. So we also had policy, we had bilingual education laws, we had policy context, and so there's just really I think a very rich sociocultural context and linguistic and social research context from which this came, and we were lucky enough to jump on and find the heritage language locus that we could then do the conferences, bring those wonderful speakers together that we've already talked about, and continue on. And then from that, and I'm going to turn it over to Dick to carry us forward, but from that we can see the field building through the Heritage Language Resource Center, through the founding of the Heritage Language Journal, through the research agenda that was developed, and then now faculty positions and so on, really a field building that continued to come from that. But Dick, and now there's some interesting policy things that I think Dick can talk about. I'll turn it over to you, Dick.
Thanks, Donna. I want to go back before I go forward. By the way, Russ Campbell was an immensely wonderful human being, and sitting in his home in Malibu, Monterey, LA, we're in LA, come on, with Ron Walton and myself and colleagues it was smoke filled because they both smoked like chimneys, and the bourbon glasses were always full. And the excitement of the moment. There are times when things are born, and it's always a confluence of elements coming from the back, the front, the side, the future, the past, the contemporary. And this was a time when you felt it, right, Donna? You just felt that things were alive. There was a decade. The decade was 1996 to 2006. In 1996, with Cal and the National Foreign Language Center and UCLA, that's where the places were happening. UCLA has always been the home of this in so many ways. But in 1996, we started talking. We had a joint heritage initiative between NFLC and Cal, and then it started happening with first Heritage Language Conference, and then the Heritage Research Conference was the last thing that Russ kind of pulled together for us. We went to Melbourne, by the way, for the community conference in Australia, which it reinforced our concept of communities, because that's what they call it, community language. And then the second conference, and then what do you know, here comes all the good publications, and here comes the National Heritage Language Resource Center, and as they say, the rest is history. But I want to go back. I want to go back a little bit to what was the electricity in that air. First off, remember, this was when the country exploded with immigrants. We finally decided that Asians were human beings, and I'm not sure we've made all of those decisions yet for the whole population, but the immigration was simply here and all around us, and it wasn't controversial the way it is today. It wasn't about border closing. It was welcoming, and people there coming from all directions. And also at that time, remember, we were talking about the end of history and the beginning of nirvana, and everything was possible, right? And the Soviet Union fell, and history ended, yeah, and all our problems were gone, and there was an optimism and electricity around it. But I want to come back. I want to go back even further. That at the National Foreign Language Center, and thanks to Dick Lambert, the National Foreign Language Center was founded in the mid-'80s on principles that were really not easily accepted by the language educators. The principles were basically usage. Find out how languages are used before you start teaching people how to use language. And Dick Lambert was very controversial in those days, but notice that's what heritage is. The heritage language, these are used languages. And Lambert was ahead of his time because he wasn't talking about heritage at that time. But also at that time, the focus was on the less commonly taught languages. We founded the National Council of Organizations of Less Commonly Taught Languages in 1990. What happened there? That was responsible for the less commonly taught languages. And immediately, higher education people started founding AATs. And whether they were in Chinese, or in Hindi or Turkic and so on, new AATs were founded. And the Chinese folks decided to find the National Coalition of Organizations of Chinese Language Schools. All of a sudden, the PRC and the Taiwanese were competing with each other to found language schools for their children and so on. And so what was going on? Because it started with less commonly taught language, it started with usage back in the 80s. And that was also part of the electricity that when you walked into the room with Russ and Donna and all you wonderful people, I call this group, excuse me, colleagues, but this is the litany of the saints here, of my colleagues here, which is truly quite remarkable. And I'm still in purgatory, I think, or limbo, or whatever that is, because I don't have that experience. My experience comes from policy, and I want to just end with a little bit that it's these two things. And now I want to finish with what I'm doing right now. And we have founded Mellon has funded this, what we call the America's Languages Project. I got sick and tired of fighting less commonly taught versus commonly taught languages. Frankly, I'm sick and tired of people calling them foreign languages. I am really tired of them calling them world languages. And because they are not world languages, these indigenous languages, these colonial languages, these world foreign language, even deaf languages, sign languages are our languages. We're responsible for them. We're responsible for keeping them. And frankly, that's what this America's Languages Initiative is all about, is saying we're all in this. We have to respect each community. Each community is unique. The Navajo community, American Indian community, or whatever in Ojibwe, these are very unique. Each one is unique. The heritage, the immigrant heritage here 2 generations, immigrant here 1 generation, refugee here just coming. These are unique communities that deserve unique treatment and so on. And all of these, including and American Indian Sign Language, but the plain sign languages, by the way, and ASL and so on, all of these are part of who we are. And we kind of treated everything as an academic exercise in my ken in the old days. And it turned out there were real people there. And the more you look at the real people, the more you listen to them and listen to their passion, listen to the leaders that they have and trust and so on, the more you understand that this heritage language, this America's languages, excuse me, is a movement. And it's a movement now that has, because of all of these players here, has caught fire. And we can go on, we can talk about the future. We've got a lot of problems, by the way, but a lot of things going on. I'll be quiet. I'm done.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Brecht. In your opinion, it's a question for all of you. What are some promising new developments in the field?
I'm sorry, can I first say something in reaction to some of what Dick just said, which was great and very, may I do that?
Of course.
I agree with you, everything that, the things you were saying about the electricity and the moment, and that all of the less commonly taught languages, that they're all American languages, heritage languages, sign language, all of them, of course, are valuable, respectable, need to be nurtured, and so on. However, when you mentioned UCLA, for example, what came to mind to me, and I can say this now, I'm retired, I recall UCLA probably in the 1980s already, when things were already happening in Spanish as a heritage language, or probably even in the 90s when I was there at some point teaching in the Cal and NFLC program that they had one summer, that we had workshops there and courses for teachers. One of the things that bothered me about the UCLA being such a prestigious university and having all of this interest in heritage languages, at that time, they didn't even have a Spanish for native speakers program. I was aghast. Here is this university receiving funding for heritage language programs, et cetera, and they are in California with so many Mexican Americans and others who speak Spanish, and they did not even have at the university a heritage language program for speakers of Spanish. The giant in the room, the giant in the country in terms of population. So I think, of course, I agree. All of these languages are important. The heritage language movement is important. All the little languages, the middle languages, all the languages, Asian languages, of course. But I have been sometimes upset about the fact that Spanish in this country, it's obvious. It is the one that has the most in the population, the most people that speak it, the most people that are in that field, in that group. And we still have a lot of holes and a lot of discrimination against that giant in the room, where sometimes perhaps I feel, and I'm just talking off the top of my head, sometimes it's cooler to be more, I don't know, supportive of the smaller group heritage languages. I think all of them are important. Obviously, they're all important, but I think we need to work also in universities that don't even have programs to this day for Spanish, which is the one that has so many students. What is happening to them? anyhow, that was my, everything else you said, I agree. It was very well said, Dick. And it's true, in the 1990s, the less commonly taught languages gained momentum and so on. But I wonder at some point, what happened in the process to Spanish as a heritage language in terms of the focus at the university on a practical level in funding and so on. When you have UCLA as an example, who is has the Heritage Language Center and doesn't even have somebody in Spanish at the helm. I wonder about that.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in with something. The very influential paper from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that came out in 2017. There's very little about Spanish, and all the boxes I noticed in the report, which highlight heritage speakers, there isn't a single Spanish speaker in that document, which I find rather shocking, right?
Anyhow, I just wanted to throw that out and see if, if any of you had any other comments related to my view. I don't know.
I'd like to just follow up with that. And I remember, I think it was Josue Gonzalez who at one point during this time talked about Spanish as the second language of the United States. And I remember that being a very controversial statement. And I think when we talk about attitudes and the sociolinguistics, Spanish has a special status. And I think that in some ways feeds into some of the observations that Anna has just made.
Well, I think it's an attitudinal issue.
Yeah.
You have a lot of immigrants who are Spanish speakers, and they're not all the same at all. We come from many different places, many different countries, many different accents, many different socioeconomic levels, and then the ones that have been here for generations and generations who are not recent immigrants. What are the attitudes toward those students at these universities? Are there even enough of them at UCLA? Places like UCLA, I mean, I don't mean to get it out in UCLA, it's just using as an example of, a great school in California. How many Hispanics are there to begin with? Just throwing that out, because it is major population.
So I'll comment I'll just comment very briefly on that. During the 6 years that I was at UC Berkeley, and at UC Berkeley, I did not have an appointment in the Spanish department. They found me unworthy to be in the Spanish department, so I was only in the School of Education. And the course for the Heritage program was taught in Chicano studies, right? And so that happened in a lot of places. In fact, Berkeley at that time wasn't even teaching Mexican literature, right? So there's interesting kinds of views that are interesting if you think about how Spanish departments work, right? And how we view the racialization of people that speak Spanish in this country, right? And that's a biggie. I don't think we can stand away from that. But I just thought I'd mention that because it's possible that at UCLA, they really were teaching Spanish to quote native speakers or as a heritage language, but it wasn't being taught in the Spanish department. I don't know.
Since I started this a little bit, I'd like to make, and you're not going to like it, but I'm going to make a comment anyhow.
Okay.
Let's not make it. It's not a zero-sum game, folks. It's not a zero-sum game. Prejudice in this country is real. And ask any Native American, American Indian, ask any African American, almost ask any person of color, including all the Latino, Latina, Latinx, and all the Latin American countries, the Native Indian who are pouring in over our borders from and the Mayan, so all of this. The discrimination is real. But as a profession, we can't do zero sum. We can't do someone else's gain is our loss, because you know where that leads us. And I know you're not doing this, but you're not intending to do this at all. And you have every right to protect by the way, it is our second language and will be our second language, and 25% of our population, and soon more and more and more. But let's just be careful that it's zero sum is in all of these other languages. they're precious to every one of them. And it doesn't mean that Spanish is not as important as it is in this country. I hope it doesn't.
Can I add one quick thing? And that is, I think we also have to recognize that this is an international phenomenon. It's not just the United States.
Yeah.
And when Dick mentioned us going to Australia for one of the meetings, where, you know, there are lots of places everywhere in the world, there are heritage languages, and there's more and more recognition of that. And one other person that I just like to mention is Bill Demert, and Native American, who brought together circumpolar indigenous peoples' languages. And we met, and there were people from Greenland and the Sami and so on, who have very similar issues that they were facing. And of course, the Irish, and I think it's important to keep remembering that we're not unique, as Dick was just saying. It's not a zero-sum game, and we're not unique. There's lots to be learned, and hopefully we can also inform the discussion around the world.
Scott, did you have a question or comment? Scott?
I do. First of all, I'm just honored and delighted to be amongst all the people that, good heavens, what now, 25 years ago that I first got enlightened and engaged about the whole issue of heritage languages. I would just like to say something from someone that had worked on the other side of it, who is the foreign devil that was trying to work with development of the Chinese heritage language world. Not saying that I made any big differences, but what I am struck by 25, 30 years on is that we are looking at generational loss. We're looking at second and third and fourth generations of Chinese language heritage learners whom, for all sorts of reasons, they want to integrate with the population of that they've come in for all these generations. We are losing huge amounts of not just language, but cultural expertise that gets, if you will, drummed out of the public school system. The heritage schools can sustain it, but the heritage schools can't maintain it. So I'm delighted that we continue to address this issue. But as I said, as someone that walked into classrooms with rosters of Wangs and Lees and Zhangs, and they said, what's this guy McGinnis doing about teaching Chinese language classes? I think there's a lot of room for us to be thinking in terms of how do we maintain these indigenous, and I'm glad somebody said tonight about the indigenous ones, the Amerindian languages. We need to treat heritage languages as not just immigrant languages, the indigenous languages as well. So I just want to say you are doing very good work, and I'm grateful to have been listening in and get reinvigorated, even though I'm working for the evil empire, also known as the Department of Defense. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Scott. Joy, would you like to chime in?
Yes, I just, sorry, it's 9:06 and I don't want 9:30 to arrive, and we haven't thought enough about community-based schools, because this is, I've already talked about the shift that Joshua Fishman brought about, but that was our first conference. And then just recognition that community-based schools exist is even sometimes now huge. I have encountered people who are leaders of community-based schools, Bulgarian, Tamil, for example. And when we start talking to each other, and I say, yeah, I mean, we have a coalition of community-based heritage language schools. You can join. You can become a language representative and reach out to your community and bring them in so that we'll all be together. We have an annual conference that you can participate in. Our conference, by the way, is coming up this Friday and Saturday, October 8th and 9th. And we would love to have you all there. But some of them have started crying. I mean, I've had two people, one woman, one man, who just sat there and started crying. And I said, what's wrong? And they go, no one has ever talked like this to me. I have always been by myself. I don't even know what other people are teaching my language, much less other languages. And if I walk up to people and I say, oh, like at ACTFL, the Foreign Language Conference, oh, I teach at a Bulgarian school. That's the first person who started crying. I teach at a Bulgarian school and I just love to talk. And she said, they look at me like, what? Bulgarian? What is that? And she said, I just feel like such an outsider. And now finally, I feel like an insider. That's the first big shift that's happening. The second big shift that's happening for community-based schools is collaborations that are happening. And this is a very new thing. Collaborating with ACTFL, with CAL, the Center for Applied Linguistics, Dick and the America's Languages Initiative. And Dick, I mean, I don't know if you talked about it enough, Dick, but these issues that we've been talking about, Dick is trying to resolve them. Make the invisible visible. Make the excellence of the invisible people and schools visible. Give them opportunities for every single language, including all the languages you guys have been mentioning. So Dick has included us, community-based schools, and everybody's so excited about it. Here we are, we're included. Joint National Committee for Languages, JNCL Nicholas, they're partnering with us. They want to advocate for the schools. The National Heritage Language Resource Center is a strong partner. And that started out, another person I want to mention is Olga Kagan, who really, I mean, she sat down with me when the National Heritage Language Resource Center was funded. And she said, okay, let's figure this out. Because I don't want to steal the show from you, and I don't want you to steal the show from me. And so we divided it up. And we took the community-based schools, and she took the universities and other schools, private schools, mostly universities. I'm almost finished talking. Now we're a member of the National Network for Early Language Learning. Besides America's Languages Initiative, we're involved now with the Global Seal and the State Seal of Biliteracy and figuring out how to get those seals for the students in schools. And there's a lot going on there. And with Maria, who's brought us into the Heritage Language Initiative. And also, we are involved with international groups. So I just had a meeting just now, planning for our conference with people from Canada, Australia, Iceland, New Zealand, who are collaborating with us. Oh, I'll say this and then I promise I'll shut up. There's an international group that's working together to develop international guidelines for community-based schools, which we really need, and thinking together about, okay, do we have a vision? Do we have goals, professional development, all those issues? So that's a big shift for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Guadalupe, would you like to?
Thank you. And I just want very briefly to respond a little bit to Dick, because I don't want to talk about zero-sum game. But my point in talking about Chicano studies and where languages are taught is a larger point, that every community, unfortunately, has ideologies of language about who in the community speaks well and who does not. And we have to be attentive to that. We have to continue to be attentive to that. Because we can actually replicate the same thing that happened in Spanish. We can replicate it in other languages. So those ideologies, and we really live in class-based, if not race-based societies all over whatever the social dominance configuration is, we have the haves and the have-nots. And that reflects on language very powerfully. So I think we have to be cautious. So are we speaking the right Bulgarian, right? Is that the good Bulgarian, or is that not as good a Bulgarian? So we're going to replicate it all over the place unless we're careful to see that people have very strong feelings about language and how we actually inform people about values about language. And it's sociolinguistics 101, right? Except that most people who are in the teaching and learning of languages have not taken sociolinguistics 101. They've come out of literature, right? So, and the best way to speak and the best way to write and all of those things. So you see that being replicated over and over again in every one of our languages.
Okay, so thank you. Thanks to everyone for all of these wonderful, this retrospective and your engaging thoughts. And now we'd like to open it up to questions. you can either raise your hand or type it in the chat, whichever feels most comfortable to you.
Well, if nobody has questions, maybe we can move on to that very last question we had planned on asking, Sybil.
Sure, I have to find it. And it is here. Okay, some of the promising new developments and how do you envision the future of heritage language education? And this is for everyone.
Yeah, I kind of did mine, didn't I? Promising development, so I'm going to be quiet.
I think the point right now that encourages me a lot is dual language immersion across the country. This is something that's growing rapidly, and I won't say without challenges. But the fact that more and more we're seeing these communities, children from these emergent bilingual communities have a place to go and a status equal to the English, the native English speakers trying to learn their language. I think it's a great development, and watching more and more of that. And I'm also really delighted to see the seals of biliteracy, and particularly the global seal, which acknowledges people not necessarily in the education system. So they can be in the heritage schools, they can be in American Indian reservation schools and not formally accepted, and yet still get acknowledged by a seal and so on. So I see a lot of very positive things happening, and those are the two that I enjoy very much.
And Jake, well, we still have you. So where do you see the America's Language Initiative and the guide in particular going? What will happen in the future as a result of this initiative?
Thank you for this opportunity. The guide, it's called now America's Languages Portal. And what this is to take programs, you have to apply, and we've worked on the application to make sure each American Indian application is totally unique. Heritage community schools application totally unique. Then there's pre-K-12, and then there's higher education and so on. This application, in order to ferret out, that's not the right word, in order to find programs that show that equality of access is possible in the United States. Access to learners and access to languages, the languages of these learners. And this website will have, I don't know how many, it's not an exhaustive website. It will have hundreds of programs in all of these areas that the reason you get in is because you're having success at increasing access. And so whether they're Native American, whether they're Alaska Native or a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, or whether they're a heritage immigrant or community schools or a K-12 or higher education, it doesn't, and so on. We just want a list of programs, a set of programs fully described for this purpose. So peers can go to those programs and say, I got the message. In this country, we must increase access. Our motivation is, we complain about language enrollments. Sure, because language is only enrolled in most of the elite communities in our country. We're leaving out all the emergent bilinguals. We're leaving out all the poor, economically rural, challenged, and inner city and so on. So the idea is, find examples of this, put it out there on here so peers can look at it, so policymakers can look at it, and so funders can look at it and say, aha, it's possible. Or let me say, this ends next September in a year, and the programs will be on this site, on America's Language Portal. There will be hundreds of programs all across all of these educational environments. We will either prove through on-the-ground evidence, not major policy statements, on-the-ground evidence that access to language education is improving in this country, or we will prove it is not. Either way, this project ends, and if it's picked up after that, it will have a solid empirical base, not on statistics. It will have an empirical base on programs you can go and search and see what their magic sauce is. And if it works for you, you take it. And if you want to fund it, go there and fund that magic sauce someplace else. That's what America's Languages Portal is about, and America's Languages Initiative. Thank you for the opportunity, Joy.
There is one question in the chat about one of the participants would like to hear more about not curricularizing language. Does anybody want to take that one up?
Guadalupe.
I think I'm going to take that up because I've been recently talking a lot about curricularizing language. And what I've been back, and Dick said something incredibly brilliant and probably attributing to Joshua Fishman, but I think it's been there by a number of great thinkers, including Dick and Donna and other people, that we know that language is acquired in use. I mean, we certainly know that language is acquired in use and language is maintained in use, right? What we often do in classrooms is make it be bits and pieces of language and order it and sequence it. Why? I mean, the theories of why we teach this before that are lost in time, right? Why we never teach the subjunctive before we teach the indicative. Why, we don't know. But this is what we've done. So that's what I call about curricularization, a bits and pieces of language approach to using language. And it turns off, right? So when we talk about Sister Judith and what she did with Maria, it's wonderful, right? Because she was not curricularizing language. She was giving Maria an opportunity to use that language for real meaning, right? So that's what I'm worried about, that all too often, as soon as we move into education, Dick, unfortunately, we think teach, right? We don't think use. And we think, and as soon as we teach, it's bits and pieces. So that's what I mean by curricularization. And so I've been talking a lot about it. I'd love all of you who are here to help me think more about this, because I just finally started after many, many years of thinking, but that's a problem, right? As soon as we put it into schools, we do something with language that we don't do in real life settings.
And it turn off the students too, so often.
Foreign Language Annals, the last volume, is an explosion about to happen in language education. If you look at it, to be sure, it's got a Cummins taint to it. But if cognitive research now is added that says it's usage, it's input and provoked by usage, and there is no cognitive evidence for grammar. All my colleagues who do nothing but grammar are going, I can't even say this in most environments, but look at it and judge it. But I think just what you said, Guadalupe, you're always 20 years ahead of everyone else. And this is, I think, going to be a real challenge coming in the next decade. Absolutely. Of what language, quote, instruction is versus language learning is.
Or development. I rather use the term
development. Yeah, thank you. That's better. Yes, of course.
And I want to add that this curricularization, what it leads to is a one size fits all approach to language teaching. Mm-hmm. And that works against heritage language learning. Yes. I also want you guys to comment on this new development, which is wonderful, experiential learning, right? Which includes internships, work opportunities, project-based learning, et cetera. Do you see that as being the way of the future?
Right now, take dual language immersion. Dual language immersion is usage, okay? It's all about you learn in two languages, you're not being taught the language. Well, they go out of school and so the Spanish children, native Spanish speakers, can go out and practice their English, or you can go into a Spanish community if you're learning Spanish and so on. Everything we're doing now is about immersing yourself in real environments, experiential environments that you're talking about. And remember, the number one cause of lack of language learning is motivation. And you want to motivate people, give them consequences to their learning and to their usage. And that's what we do when we send them abroad and put them in the country. You can't say something without having a consequence, and put them in our communities. There are real consequences. And how we turn language development into usage, exposure, experiences with consequences will determine success in the next generation of learners, in my view.
And also, Scott, I see you have your hand up, so I'm sorry to jump in, but I have to add to Dick's, also putting them in touch with people who actually use the language in dynamic ways. I know the Hindi community is very, very concerned about the loss of Hindi, and where Surendra Gambhir once said, wherever English grows, nothing else grows, because English is taking over Hindi. But what they're doing, and now online, is putting young kids in touch with professionals who are using Hindi, you know, to write newspapers, to write books in all kinds of exciting ways, and saying, hey, here is this is exciting. Sorry,
Joy,
Scott.
related to that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Scott.
You can go ahead. We'll have one last comment. I want to make sure you go ahead, get your word in.
Well, I just wanted to mention that, Joy, I've heard you talk about the COD framework and applying that to education. And I think that's a great idea. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Really quickly, Joe, it was Francois Grin and Joe Lobianco. Can you hear me? It says I'm muted. Francois Grin and Joe Lobianco came with this COD framework capacity, which is, you know how to use the language, and you need capacity. The higher your proficiency in the language is, the more experiences you're going to have to use the language, and you're going to be able to use it in more and more places at higher and higher levels. But they argued capacity is not sufficient. You also have to have opportunity, and that is places where it's not only okay to use the language, but it's required to use the language, that the language has to be used. Because if it's okay to use the language, it's easy enough to just leave it behind. But capacity and opportunity are also not sufficient. They're necessary, but not sufficient. You also have to have what Dick just said, desire. Why do I want to learn this language? What's my motivation? And this, I gave a talk at Ana Lucia Lico's school, Abrace, which is Portuguese school in Virginia. She's actually part of the coalition. She's part of the core team, and she's on here. I wanted to mention her before, but I talked at her school once, and I mentioned once I got to desire, and I put up all of these various reasons that someone would want to learn the language. The parents were going, whoa, I never thought of that. I only thought it was so they could speak to their grandparents. Well, there's tons of reasons that you might want to. Anyway, so thanks for asking that, Maria. Was that good enough as an answer?
Great.
Capacity, opportunity, and desire. You have to have all three.
Perfect. And I want to mention that in Spanish, you are now seeing Spanish as a heritage language. You're seeing all three being emphasized, right? Opportunity has really come of age now with the creation of experiential learning, or the proliferation of experiential learning opportunities and professional training in Spanish.
And we did a special issue of the Heritage Language Journal where the first chapter was describing that whole framework. And then different people, including you, Maria, talked about what does this look like in our language? What does this look like in our schools? Capacity, opportunity, and desire. Very interesting to see how different people are building those.
Scott, if you have a 1 minute comment, you're welcome to make it.
I do. My comment is, first of all, I'm very grateful to be rejoining the people that shaped my career for many years, to Anna, Joy, Donna, Richard, Maria. I'm still on a 5-year shelf life because we have one daughter in grad school and another one just started her sophomore year of college. So I'm still at a point in which I will still be able to feel things from you. So what I would like to pose to you all, and I put my email address in there, is that to the extent that I can make things possible, what can the government do to help you serve these communities? I know it's always been an unfunded mandate when it comes to heritage communities. But before I step out the door, I would like to make things more possible for all of you to make things, because as someone that was very invested as an academic in the early 1990s when we finally figured out that the heritage communities were where we needed to make things happen. If I can do until hopefully our youngest gets through undergrad before the bills have to get paid, you've got my email address. Give me
Yes.
suggestions. And thank you for this opportunity to join you all. You are an inspiration to me and you always have been. It's good to see you all again.
Thank you, Scott.
Can I make one comment?
It really brief.
Okay. I just want to say that I think the hope for the future also is in the explosion of resources that we're getting. Dick talked about his.
Yeah.
I think the Heritage Language Exchange, I think that provides for a lot of hope for the future. And I just like to mention that the Center for Applied Linguistics has archived its heritage language site, but there's a lot of really good information about languages, speakers, communities, and so on at cal.org/heritage. And I know the National Heritage Language Resource Center and all, there's just a lot more information, and hopefully we can get it to the teachers and communities who are serving the population.
And thanks, Joey. They could see lots of pictures they could laugh at of me from 25, 30 years ago.
Okay, and our time is running out, and I want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences, thoughts, and vision. And thank you for allowing us all to join you on this wonderful transformative journey that heritage language
Yes.
teaching is. And
Thank
that's
you,
what it
Maria,
is.
for pulling this together.
Yeah, and I would
Sorry,
like to
Sybil.
thank Maria Carreira especially for creating the HLX initiative. It's really amazing, and I think we are all very fortunate to be a part of it. Before you zoom out, I'd like to invite you to join us for two great events. On December 2nd, we will gather for a community read and discussion of post-method language instruction. There's plenty of information on the website. I don't have time to go into it. And on February 5th and 6th, we will host the Heritage Language Programs Fair, which will focus on, guess what? Heritage language programs. So please check out the website and look at the key dates, and we look forward to seeing your abstracts and having you participate. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you for having us. Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for supporting us. It's just been a wonderful evening.
Good to see you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Donna.
Bye.
Bye, Joy.